Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I'm going to bless you with part 3 of my build making guide. If you recall, in part 1 we covered damage optimization. In part 2 we covered defensive layers and recovery methods. And now in part 3 the heaviest focus will definitely be on best in slot affixes for items and blessings.
A round bottom boiling flask, 5,000 milliliters.
Well, I'd cook him one of those.
One of these? No, this is a volumetric flask. You wouldn't cook in one of these.
We're also going to touch on mana and resource management, as well as minions and tools and resources that can be useful in Last Epoch. All of the PoE players coming into Last Epoch will know very well the benefit of a strong toolkit, so I'll try to cover the most useful ones in here. But thankfully, Last Epoch's toolkit is much simpler than PoE's. And just to reiterate one more time, this build making guide is meant to help new and veteran players alike. So I try to keep it general, and I try to add some details that a lot of players may not have thought about or may not have considered from that perspective. But I also try to keep it generalized as much as possible so that it can remain valuable through time and through all of the patches that EHG are going to release in the future. So while I may use certain builds as an example, I will not be going too deep into actual builds here. Anyways, let's jump in. Irashaimase! Let's start with itemization best in slot affixes. And what I'm going to cover here is affixes that are highly unique to a certain slot in your item arsenal, or perhaps highlight the scaling of certain affixes as well. So starting off with skill levels. The only way to raise your skill levels through your item affixes, outside of uniques of course, is with helm, chest, and relic prefixes. And every single skill in the game has a prefix in one of these three that will help it raise its level. And for every single skill, only one of these item slots will be able to contain the plus skill level. It goes from +1 at tier 1 to +4 at tier 7, and it scales quite well from tier 5 to tier 7. So this is certainly something that you want to consider in your build if your primary DPS skill can benefit significantly from +4 skill levels, let's say. Next up, we have class-specific bonuses that are present only in helm and chest prefixes. These can be build defining for certain builds. However, many of them are useless, so definitely take a look at what they are, and especially try to compare them to other affix slots. So for example, lightning critical strike multiplier for mage is something that can spawn in your helmet. You can compare that to your critical multi-slot in your weapons, and once you do that, you'll realize that it's not that amazing. Maybe it's useful for certain builds. Next up, you'll notice that chest affixes, prefix and suffix both, have a 1.5 times multiplier compared to other slots. For example, tier 7 plus skill level affixes get the exact same +4 to skill bonus as your helm. So they don't actually get multiplied by 1.5. They don't become +6 skill levels. The only 1.5 times multiplier benefit that you get is for the secondary bonus. So for example, it might be 100% spell damage for helmet, but 150% spell damage for your chest. So that means that tier 7 plus skill affixes for chest are not quite as good compared to tier 7 affixes in helm or relic. They're still solid if your build can really benefit from plus skills, but they're just slightly worse. Then you have tier 7 resistances, which can go up to like 100 and something res. And clearly, you don't need your resistances to be beyond 75% in most cases. So unless you're running a build that benefits from res beyond the cap, you don't want that in your chest. So keep in mind this 1.5 times multiplier and plan accordingly. Amulet, shield, and catalyst affixes also have a 1.17 times multiplier. So take that into account as well. Tier 7 resistances might not be amazing in those slots. Movement speed can only spawn in boots. And as you know, in ARPGs, movement speed is phenomenal. So if you want more of it, make sure to have it in your boots. Basically, boots without movement speed are kind of useless in this game. Next, we have spell crit chance, and this is a prefix that can only spawn in weapons, relic, amulet, and catalyst. And why it is significant is because spell critical strike chance as a prefix is 1.5 times greater multiplicatively compared to just a normal critical strike prefix, which applies to everything beyond just spells. And what that means is generally, if you're running spells and you want to max out your crit, you want to have spell crit in as many affixes as possible until you max your crit at 100%. And you want to generally avoid critical strike chance affixes, for example, in your rings, because they don't give you nearly as much as if you get spell crit in your relic, amulet, or catalyst, or any slot that you can get it. And so that's the concept of opportunity cost, what you're gaining or losing by utilizing certain affixes versus others. And that is a concept that you can easily generalize across your entire itemization thought process and optimization. Next, we have hybrid armor, and this is a newer affix that was just recently added, and it can spawn in gloves, boots, belt, chest, and helmet. If you don't have any other sources of hybrid armor from your passive tree or uniques, getting a tier 7 in your belt is what I generally prefer to utilize here, plus a tier 5 in one of these other affix slots. If you get it in the chest, you're going to be likely maxed out at 100%, and if you get it in the helmet, you're capped at around 90% critical strike damage reduction. And I already covered why hybrid armor with critical strike damage reduction is such a good affix in the defensive layers video. So if you want to check that out and you haven't seen it, do check it out. I do prefer hybrid armor over critical strike avoidance, and I make a pretty solid argument for it in the video. Next, we have hybrid health, which can only spawn in gloves, boots, and belt. Hybrid health is strictly superior to having the flat health affix or the percent health affix, which can all spawn in gloves, boots, and belt as well. So make sure any chance you can utilize this affix. It's a rare affix as well. So it is definitely the best in slot for most builds once you get into the late game. And you probably want to consider at least running it in all 3 of these affixes, at least at tier 5. Cooldown reduction can only spawn in boots and belt, and a lot of builds greatly benefit from CDR. So if you want to run CDR, make sure to get it in your boots and belt. However, keep in mind that the tier 5 to tier 7 scaling is not great. Most affixes, when you take them from tier 5 to tier 7, double in power roughly. With CDR, it only goes up from 20% at tier 5 max to 32% at tier 7 max. And what that means is it's a 60% increase, 1.6x, rather than a 2x increase. So in many cases, unless CDR hugely benefits the build, I tend to leave it at tier 5 because there are so many other great affixes in boots and belt, like hybrid health, hybrid armor, movement speed. It competes with many other great affixes, making it a lower priority in most cases. Endurance threshold is not a great affix right now, but the one thing I wanted to mention with it, and it is something that we can generalize as a concept, is that the tier 5 to tier 7 scaling for it is actually incredibly strong. It goes up by a factor of 2.47 times if you look at the max at tier 5 versus the max at tier 7. So if you do want to scale the endurance threshold, you might want to consider running as many tier 7 affixes as possible. And you can generalize this concept to every other affix slot as well. Consider the tier 5 to tier 7 scaling in all of them. Don't just blindly go, oh, I want more of this affix, so I'm going to go tier 7. In many cases, that is not optimal. Throwing mana cost reduction is a ring-specific affix that can be build enabling for a lot of throwing builds. The scaling on it is kind of interesting, and I'll throw it up on the side as I'm walking through this here. But sealing it at tier 1 can be very beneficial if you're just looking to reduce the mana cost of the skill, because at tier 5, it still has that exact same -3 mana cost reduction. However, if you want even more mana cost reduction, you kind of need it at tier 7 for the -5 mana cost reduction. And these are very much build dependent. Some builds just want it sealed at tier 1, and some want it at tier 7 just to be able to spam their main throwing attack skill. Throwing attack speed is another great affix for throwing builds, which only spawns in rings and gloves. So take that into consideration. The scaling it suffers a little bit similar to CDR in boots. It's not as good. So you might not want to get an Exalted tier 7 affix for throwing attack speed, and you might want to just settle at tier 5. Frailty chance is another useful one that we went over in the defensive layers part of the videos, and it can only spawn in gloves, relic, and amulet. Generally, for most builds that have high hit counts, you're totally okay with just sealing it at tier 1 or tier 2 and keeping your suffix slot open for a tier 5 something else, resistances for example, or maybe health. And that is because you easily attained the max 3 stacks of frailty, even with tier 1 seal or tier 2 sealed frailty chance. Resistance penetration is unique to amulet, and most builds can benefit from res pen. And if you do not have any resistance shred or any other sources of resistance penetration, tier 7 resistance pen is essentially 15% more damage. That gets diluted the more resistance shred and the more resistance pen you get from other sources. Keep that in mind and do that calc on your end. But this can also be a really useful affix to consider. Minion spell and minion fist damage can only spawn in scepters and staves. Wands cannot get these two bonuses, and these are quite useful for a lot of different builds. And then in the minion section, I'll cover these in a little bit more detail with regards to other minion damage amplifying bonuses. All resistances is a shield specific affix. No other slot can get all resistances, and the number is actually surprisingly high. If you can afford because this affix is incredibly rare. So if you happen to have a tier 7 all res and if you're running a shield, this can make your itemization so much easier by just throwing a bunch of all res in your shield. All res while channeling is a relic specific and relic unique suffix. However, only a few builds can benefit from this one, just because even if you're not channeling for, let's say, 20% of the time, if you don't have max res during that 20% of the time, you might just get one shot. So over reliance on this one can be risky unless you can guarantee you're running 99% or 100% of the time with channeling skills. So like Warpath, for example, can utilize this one to a greater extent. Dodge rating can spawn in many different item slots, but when it comes to weapons, swords are the only weapons that can get dodge rating in the suffix. So that can be useful for certain builds. Keep it in mind. Critical strike multiplier is a prefix that can only spawn in a weapon, relic, and amulet. So for crit builds, you probably want to have at least tier 5 in all three of these slots, especially in weapon slot. Weapon slot can give you a huge benefit for crit multi. Elemental damage over time is a very interesting prefix as well. These are the item slots that it can spawn in, but the interesting thing about it is that the range of damage that can spawn on the prefix is much higher, 1.83 times higher than other percent damage affixes. So for example, if you just have cold percent damage, elemental damage over time is going to be 1.83 times higher than that cold damage affix if you have the exact same tiers. So what that means is if you're running an elemental dot build, you want this affix in as many of these slots as you can afford. And you probably want to avoid having any other percent damage bonuses in terms of prefixes, just because they don't give you nearly as much as this one. And if you recall from part 1 of this build making guide series, when it comes to damage optimization, percent damage bonuses are additive with each other. So elemental damage over time being so high essentially dilutes any other damage bonus that you can get because they're also much lower numbers. This point right here is just general advice. I like to use exalted belt slots for defensive affixes over offensive. Generally that means suffixes versus prefixes. The only exception I might make is elemental dot, because the damage numbers are so much higher. Even then, belt suffixes are so strong defensively, I might consider just prioritizing defensive suffixes over prefixes. And one more thing you want to take a look at when trying to optimize your itemization is the scaling of your item slots when you go from tier 1 to tier 5 and then to tier 7. Certain slots are very strong at tier 1. Like the earlier example I used of lightning critical strike multiplier for mage. That is an affix that doesn't scale very well when you raise it up from tier 1 to tier 5. There are affixes that you would much rather have at tier 5 than lightning crit multi. So what you could do is just seal that tier 1 crit multi because it still gives you a significant enough number at tier 1. And then invest your forging potential into something else. The best way to assess this is to look at how much does an item scale when it comes to moving from tier 1 to tier 5. So in the case of Mage's lightning crit multi right here, we're scaling from 17 to 21 from tier 1 to tier 5, and that is a factor of 1.71. That is a very, very weak scaling, not worth your investment to take it all the way up from tier 1 to tier 5. Another example is attributes. Attributes can be a very popular choice in many item slots. So if you're stacking intelligence, for example, at tier 1, you just get 1. That's it. At tier 5, you can get up to 8. So the scaling is 8-fold. Much better than the lightning crit multi example we saw earlier. So never seal tier 1 intelligence. You're not getting anything out of that. Here's another neat example. Chance to gain 20 mana when you directly cast Rune Bolt or Fireball. It scales from 6% at tier 1 to 20% at tier 5. So that's roughly a 3-fold increase. So this is not an affix you want to seal at tier 1. If you're going to utilize it, think about utilizing it at tier 5 or tier 7. And so taking that into consideration when you're optimizing your affixes in your build. And now let's talk about blessings and how you determine what is best in slot for you specifically and for your build. With this section right here, I really want to just teach you the thought process around how to optimize your blessings and what makes them best in slot for your build. The current stat lines for all of these blessings are somewhat irrelevant because you can easily generalize what I'm going to talk about and adjust it as patches change some of the numbers or add different blessings, etc. So Last Epoch has 5 different timeline blessings that can increase your power. All the other blessings are not really relevant in terms of power increase. They just give you item drops, etc. And so the way you want to think about blessings is when you're looking and assessing the different bonuses in them, you want to convert them to tier 1 or tier 5 or tier 7 or whatever affix slots in your gear. Most blessings roughly give you as much power as a tier 7 affix slot. However, some blessings give you more and some blessings give you less. And some blessings can be completely unique such that they do not spawn in any prefix or suffix in a rare or exalted item. Those can be build defining and pretty much best in slot for builds depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So let's use the Black Sun blessings as an example. Spell and Throwing Leech is very much unique and you cannot get it as a prefix or suffix anywhere else in your build. So if you're short on Leech, this is the only thing you want to consider for Black Sun Blessing. Void Rest Shred is something else that's unique and the same applies to any other Rest Shred. Rest Shred cannot be sourced from suffixes and prefixes in your gear. So if you don't have a source of Void Rest Shred chance, consider Black Sun for it. However, Void Knight in general is the main void damage user and he has Void Rest Shred at his disposal pretty easily. So this is not a frequently used blessing. Critical Strike Multiplier is indeed something that does get utilized in the Black Sun blessing. And it is equivalent to roughly a tier 6, let's say, relic comparatively. So it's decent. It's not tier 7, but it's decent. Because the alternative is, let's say, health. This is also something that is frequently utilized on the Black Sun timeline. However, health is only a tier 5 blessing, so it's one of the weakest ones in the game. But still, if the other ones are not benefiting your build, like if you're not running a crit multi-build, health is still a decent choice. Void Res is a great choice as well. It's tier 7, so it's better than health. So if you're lacking Void Res and you're not running, let's say, the Void Res gloves implicits, you definitely want to consider Black Sun for it because it just simply maxes out your Void Res once you get the best roll for it. Ignite on Hit, if you compare it to a weapon Ignite on Hit, is a tier 7 stat line. When it comes to amulets, on the other hand, it's quite a bit more than a tier 7. But that just means that maybe you don't want to be using amulets for Ignite on Hit potentially. And then you just have percent increased damage. That's always going to be a tier 7. So in most cases, Black Sun is utilized for Leech, Crit Multi, Health, or Void Res. Ignite is just very much Ignite build specific and it's useful as well. When it comes to ending the storm timeline, Lightning Rest Shred is unique. If you're running a lightning build, you want to be getting this unless you have an alternative source for Rest Shred. Lightning Res is useful here as well, a tier 7 suffix. Mana is a tier 6 prefix, so not bad as well. Stun Chance is great because it's a tier 6 weapon suffix and you can't easily get it in other sources. So if your weapon suffixes are blocked and you can't get Stun Chance in them, this is an excellent source for that because mana can spawn in quite a few prefixes. Depending on the build, mana might not be an issue. So if that's the case, Stun Chance is an excellent choice for this blessing. If you happen to be running a health regen build, this is by far best in slot because it's essentially a tier 7 plus a tier 5 item slot. The amount of power packed into this blessing is phenomenal. Freezing Rate Multiplier is somewhat translatable to a tier 7 prefix. However, the prefixes also give you cold res, so it's not a one-to-one translation here, but for certain builds, it can be a best in slot choice. Shock on Hit and lightning and cold damage are generally not utilized here, but they are an option. Reign of Dragons is an interesting timeline. Most people like to use crit avoidance in it, I've noticed, but I personally prefer to build around all resist from Reign of Dragons because it gives you 20% for 7 resistant types, which is 140% resistances in total. And if none of that ends up getting wasted, that is the equivalent of 2 tier 7 suffixes. So this is one of the best sources of resistances in the entire game. And if you can itemize around it in a way that a small portion of the all resist numbers gets wasted, you definitely want to take it instead of crit avoidance. And let's say even if 3 of these 20% bonuses are redundant and not doing anything in your build, just the 4 times 20 giving you 80%, that is more than a tier 7 suffix. So it can still be superior to crit avoidance. So do the math in your build. Consider your class's strengths and weaknesses when it comes to resist. Consider the other sources of resistances that you have. So for example, if you're running lightning res here and void res in the Black Sun timelines, all of a sudden those 2 res types are useless, so you're not getting much out of that. And so this choice can be very much build dependent. But most builds in Last Epoch are going to be choosing between these 2 options for Reign of Dragons. The other choices are alright, and the only one that I might make an argument for is Bleed on Hit for bleed builds. Anything else is just not as good as the all res and crit avoid. I didn't even bother listing poison res shred in here because the poison ailment on its own already reduces your poison resistances, so it kind of dilutes poison res shred. When it comes to Age of Winter, there is a unique option in physical or cold resistance shred. So same thing with any other res shred. If you're running a fizz or cold build, you probably want to consider using this. Otherwise, I love to get armor percent in this blessing, because it is a tier 7 plus tier 1 suffix if you compare it to, let's say, belt. If you're running a block build, block chance and effectiveness can be useful. It is a 2 times tier 7 block chance bonus relative to what can spawn in a ring suffix, but only a tier 5 block effectiveness relative to what can spawn in a ring. Frostbite on hit is surprisingly unique to this timeline. So if you're running a frostbite build, you might want to consider it depending on what your frostbite chance is. It can be a really good source of frostbite. Cold and physical resistances are solid choices in here as well if you're not running the all res blessing. Endurance threshold as a suffix is not in a great place right now, but if it gets buffed, this is another option in here. And finally, we have Spirits of Fire blessing as well. My absolute top favorite in this one is flat armor, because it's the equivalent of a tier 7 plus tier 5 flat armor if you were to source it from, let's say, a helmet suffix. If you're running a necrotic or fire damage build, you can get your res shred from this blessing as well. Another interesting option here is armor while channeling, which is equivalent to 3 times tier 7 armor suffixes in helmet. So if you're running a build that has 100% uptime on channeling, this is likely best in slot for you. Even if your armor scaling from other item slots is not that great, this is going to add a lot of survivability for you. And then you have a few other options which are more situational depending on your build type, but can be useful overall as well. And so to highlight again, this is how you want to translate blessings into prefix and suffix slots in your rare and exalted gear. How much relative power are you getting from every single blessing that you're considering is what should be driving your decision making for what is best in slot for your build. And now let's talk about mana and resource management. This is a topic that is very class specific. Basically, mana regen affix, it's a prefix that you can slot in quite a few items, but considering how contested some of those prefix slots can be, I would recommend potentially using it as best in slot for rings, belt, and relic if you really need additional mana. The reality is pretty much every single class has some sort of generating mana, either because of mana on hit from certain skills or from 0 mana skill usage, passives, or from chest, helmet, class-specific prefixes, or from unique items. Quite a few class-specific methods of generating mana. However, if you cannot fit any of them into your build, mana regen is an option. Mana on hit or crit is not an affix, but it is something that is available on certain skill nodes or passives or unique items. Skill mana efficiency, pretty much the same. Not available as a rare or exalted prefix or suffix. There are some skill mana efficiency class specific prefixes in helmet or chest. There are also idols that will give you mana efficiency only for specific skills. But just keep in mind that this is mana efficiency for the skill and not mana cost reduction. And what that means is rather than subtracting, let's say 10% of the skill's mana cost, if you have 10% skill mana efficiency, that means you're dividing the skill's mana cost by 1.1. Another good source of skill mana efficiency is only for certain skills. Incremental attributes can improve the mana efficiency as well. There is also a fairly new affix that gives you mana on potion, and it's an experimental affix. This one is very hard to itemize around, but if you manage to pull it off, and if you have like 8 to 9 potions, this can be a really solid way of managing your mana as well. Foot of the Mountain is another interesting option here, and I personally love using it in certain builds. It requires you to be fairly static, unfortunately, and if you stay in the same place for 3 seconds, all of your skills cost 6 less mana. And why that is significant is because any skill node that increases the mana cost of skills by a percentage, that percent mana cost increase gets applied after the 6 mana cost reduction from Foot of the Mountain. So if you have a 6 mana cost skill, this would bring it down to 0, and any percent mana cost multipliers would not be applied because you're at 0. So Foot of the Mountain can be incredibly build enabling for certain skills. So it is always something that I'm going to think at the back of my head when I look at a low mana cost skill. But other than that, mana management is highly class specific. So you have to look at the various mana cost management tools that your class has and utilize those. I also have a few notes on minions, and I'm mostly going to talk about itemization with regards to minions. However, I'm going to keep it quite high level because minions work pretty much in the exact same way as your hero. They either do damage with hits or damage over time, or they can apply ailments as well. So if you look at the damage optimization video that I had, that applies the exact same way to minions, except you want the minion tag in front of all of those prefixes and suffixes that you might consider for boosting your damage. Instead of physical damage, you want minion physical damage suffixes. And generally, the best way to get minion percent increased damage is through your weapon. And there are a few weapons that don't actually have any minion damage suffixes. These are wands, one-handed maces, and two-handed maces and daggers. So you might want to avoid those for minion builds. And then scepters and staves are excellent options for builds that utilize minion physical and spell damage at the same time, because they have both suffixes, so you can combo them up nicely. And then you have two-handed swords, one-handed axe, and two-handed axe that have minion spell, as well as minion melee and minion dot. The problem with these three is that they don't synergize very well. There is no spell that is melee, but these can be good options as well depending on the build. Spears have minion melee and minion dot, no minion spell. And something else that we can notice is that none of our items, suffixes and prefixes, give minion flat damage. However, this is getting addressed in 1.0, so EHG have noticed this as well, and they are adding brand new affixes that will give us minion flat damage. So keep an eye out for those. This will change minion itemization drastically. And that is another reason I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, because I'm not sure how 1.0 is going to shake things up. Similarly, there are no minion resistance penetration affixes currently, but this will get addressed with 1.0. So check out the patch notes when they come out and think about how you want to itemize your minion builds based on these two additions to the game. And finally, let's cover some of the tools and resources that I find most useful. Starting with Last Epoch's guide. This is available within the game. You saw me utilize it in some of the videos as well, and it is pretty decent. There are pieces of info that you will learn from if you just take a look at it. Next is the website that I use the most by far, and that is Last Epoch Tools. And you already saw me utilize it for various educational purposes to showcase affixes and other things for you. But in here, there is a build planner where you can set all of your equipment, items, and blessings, and then take a look at how much your resistance is, your defenses are, attributes, health mana, etc. Offensive side, you can see crit multi, ailments, endurance threshold, endurance percent, glancing blow, critical strike avoid, and crit damage reduction. You can see minion info, as well as other info here, as well as even damage calculation for just a few skills. This is an extremely useful build planner that I recommend everybody to utilize it. You can also import your own characters. It's extremely easy. You just need to plug in your character name. You can share a link to your build planner's build. You can also generate a loot filter. I'm not sure how good this one is. I've never really used it, but you can do a ton with this build planner. And that's not the only useful thing. You can look up all of various skill tags so that you know which percent bonus damage is applied to them or what kind of scaling they have. You can check every single item's prefix and suffix, as well as the brand new uniques that are going to be released on 1.0. Once they're out, you can just click on items and then uniques, and it's just going to filter on those 1.0 uniques pretty easily for you. You can also look up Temporal Sanctum and other endgame dungeon daily rewards in here, because these are predetermined. So for example, in the Temporal Sanctum today, enemies drop substantially more runes. There is a cache of builds submitted by various build creators, some of them better than others obviously. So you have to learn to recognize the good builds versus the not so good ones. There's a brand new loot filter section here as well. I'm seeing a ladder section being added. I know that the developer behind this website takes good care of it and updates everything as early as possible. Next, I would recommend for you to get used to Tank Lab as well. In here, you saw me utilize the armor, block, damage, ward calculators, EHP calculator as well, just to get used to some of these defensive mechanics. However, there are other useful elements within this website as well. And finally, I'm listing max throw and ice events. A lot of people know these, so this is not anything new to anybody. Anyways, all of these websites have a ton of useful information that you can learn from. And for me personally, the end goal of learning is to be able to build and iterate on top of that knowledge and arrive at something even better. And we have finally come to the end of my 3-part build making guide series. The 3 of them together ended up being close to an hour and a half, and we covered a ton of ground, from damage optimization to defensive layers and recovery, to item best in slot discussions, as well as ways in which you can interpret and assess item affixes and whether they are best in slot for you, and the best way in which you can gauge best in slot blessings. And then at the end, we had a little bit on mana management and on minions. So once again, keep in mind that Last Epoch is a very dynamic game. The devs continue updating it, and I guarantee you there will be more and more updates in the future. So some of this information may not be as relevant a year or 2 from now. I will try to keep the document up to date, however, and who knows, maybe I do updated guides in the future as well. Because through the process of making these 3 videos, I learned a lot as well, through feedback from everybody that saw the videos and appreciated them, but thought that there were areas for improvement. So a huge thank you to everybody. Some great lessons from me, and I hope you also learned something from these videos as well. If you did learn something from these 3 videos, consider dropping a like or a subscribe or coming by on Twitch and checking out my Last Epoch gameplay. But whatever you choose to do, take it easy and gochiso sama deshita.